Alright, so today we're going to be determining the thickness of aluminum foil, which you obviously can't directly measure. But what we do have for you to use is an aluminum cylinder, which you can measure what about it? You can measure the mass, and you can determine the volume in one of two ways. Since it's a cylinder, one way you could determine it would be with water displacement. The other way you could do it is just by using a ruler. But I want you to think about which of those two ways is going to give you the greatest uncertainty. Alright, so if you can measure the mass and the volume of the aluminum, you can determine the density. And we know that density is something called an intensive property. That means it doesn't depend on how much of it you have. So the density of the aluminum cylinder is going to be the same as the density of the aluminum foil you're going to be measuring. So what we've done is we've cut 5 squares of different sizes of aluminum foil for you to measure. Now, those squares, you can determine the length and the width, but you can't measure the height directly. But you can measure the mass. So, if you know the density of a material and you know the mass of it, you can determine the volume by simply rearranging this equation to solve for volume. So it becomes volume is equal to the mass divided by the density. So, for each of these squares, you can determine the thickness by dividing the volume that you calculate from the density of mass by the area that you measure. Now make sure when you're measuring these squares, you use the appropriate level of detail, always approximating 1 digit. Okay, so additionally to individually determining the thickness, we can graphically determine the thickness by plotting the volume as the y-axis and the area as the x-axis, because the slope, or rise over run, is going to be what you get when you divide the volume by the area, which in this case is going to leave you with the height. So you'll be determining the thickness of the aluminum foil, and then you'll be completing the rest of the lab handout.